altar, the Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Bear your cross as you wait for the crown. Tell the world of the treasures you found.
Moving on this morning in our disciple series, and we are in Mark chapter 8 this morning. If you have your Bibles and would like to open up there, or if you have your devices and want to zing over to there, that's where we will be starting this morning. But I want to set things up with kind of painting a picture in sports history. Again, I say it all the time, I'm kind of a sports buff and a sports nut, and so I remember moments in sports history, and I remember this one well, and I think a lot of you will, at least if you were born after 1993. If not, then you're not going to remember this. The setting is this: January 1993, the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, California, Bills versus Cowboys. The stage is one of the biggest moments a person will ever get in their entire life: the Super Bowl. Guys, it doesn't get bigger than that right there. Super Bowl 27 to be exact. Just for giggles, I was kind of looking at things. The national anthem was sung by none other than Garth Brooks himself. The halftime show featured Michael Jackson, and the official coin toss was done by O.J. Simpson. What a cast of characters there, right? Woof, that's all over the place. The setup for what I'm about to show you in this video, that hopefully is more than just 1 second like last week. The setup, we are in the fourth quarter of the game. Buffalo Bills quarterback Frank Reich, yes, the very same Frank Reich that is now the head coach of the Indianapolis Colts, dropped back for a pass and was quickly sacked by a Cowboys defensive lineman. And what ensued next is one of the most memorable moments in Super Bowl history.
Jeffco, and fumble, and Leon Lett picks it up at the 40. Take a look out, here he goes. From behind, the Bills came and knocked it out of his hand.
It's not going to be a touchdown.
No, it's not. Don Beebe caught him from behind.
Leon Lett will forever go down in history as one of the most infamous people in Super Bowl history. And in the end, here's the deal. What's really funny, actually, is just bonus information. Like 18 months later, he had a similar incident in another game where he fumbled the ball pretty spectacularly as well. And in the end, the play didn't really matter that much, as the Cowboys were already at that point up by 35 points and would go on to win by that margin 52-17. So it really didn't matter much. But I think the play itself illustrates the common mindset that we often have in life. I mean, we do that a lot, don't we? Like, we don't want to admit that, but we start to kind of showboat a little bit. We start to like let up a little bit. We start to celebrate a little too soon. We get caught up in the glory of the moment, and we don't consider the goal that lies ahead of us. And such was the case for Jesus and his disciples at this point that we're going to read this morning in Mark's gospel. And we've made quite a jump since we left off last week. If you remember last week, we left off in Nazareth. Jesus in his own hometown. He is rejected by his people. That's the beginning of Mark chapter 6. And then today what we're going to talk about, we show up in Mark chapter 8. And like I said, we've made a pretty big jump, and so a lot of things have happened in between that. Jesus has sent his 12 disciples out on their first ministry trip. He has fed the 5,000. He has walked on water. He has healed a deaf and mute man. He feeds 4,000. Whew. It's a lot of stuff going on there, guys, which brings us up to speed for where we're going to be today. And with tensions as high as they have been between Jesus and the Pharisees, they once again confront Jesus in a moment, and they demand something of him in an effort to trap him and to damage his reputation. And we were just talking about this morning, Brian and I, where it's so interesting if you read especially Mark's gospel, there's a point where the Pharisees go and they're almost like Jesus groupies. They just follow Jesus around wherever he goes. They're like really interested in what he's doing. They really want to get him. They really want to trap him, but they really want to see what he's going to do. And we see in Mark chapter 8, starting at verse 11, it says, when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had arrived, he's at this time back in the town of the Decapolis. If you'll remember last time we talked about that, the area of the 10 towns, this highly Gentile and highly pagan area. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had arrived, they came and started to argue with him. Now, I don't know about you, but there's probably a few things that I don't do when it comes to Jesus. Arguing would be one of those things. It's just a really stupid moment in Scripture here. They come and they start to argue with him. Testing him, they demanded, listen to all these words here. They're testing him. They're demanding that he show them a miraculous sign from heaven to prove his authority. Now you're thinking to yourself, how dumb is this? Like, I believe with every bit of me that these Pharisees have been around as Jesus has cast out demons and healed paralytic people and done all of the thing, calming the storm. They've known this. And so they're asking for Jesus to prove, though, from heaven. See, there was a thought back in Jewish time that many people were able to do some pretty miraculous things as it had to do on land. But to call something down from heaven or to do something out of heaven would be like this. It was signed and sealed and delivered. That would be the deal right there. That would show that you were really, truly somebody. Verse 12 says, when he heard this, he sighed deeply. And that's a really interesting. You see this moment, Pharisees, Jesus, do something like really, really cool. And Jesus goes, like really, come on. He sighs deeply in his spirit and says, why do these people keep demanding a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, I will not give this generation any such sign. And then he got back into his boat. And this is a really big, 3 words here. And left them. And he crossed to the other side of the lake. And I want you to kind of hold on to that part of the story because it informs everything that we're going to talk about this morning. It sets up the whole trajectory of everything that we're going to be talking about in this entire section. Starting in Mark 8, Jesus is illustrating. I'm just going to set everything up right here so you'll see where we're going and everything this morning. Jesus is illustrating here in Mark chapter 8 the difference between those who are permanently spiritually blind and those whose spiritual blindness is temporary. And on the one hand, you have the Pharisees' unwillingness to receive the truth. That is a terminal condition. We've talked about that. Their hearts are hard. None of God's word is getting into these Pharisees. And then again, verse 13 is like the ultimate condemnation here. An ultimate consequence of their willful spiritual blindness and hard-heartedness. Jesus left them. In fact, what's really interesting at this point is this marks the final conflict with the religious leaders in Galilee. Jesus isn't going to duke it out with them anymore in this whole area that he's been in for a large part of his ministry. From this point forward, the Lord's miracles and the Lord's teaching is primarily intended for his disciples. We'll see that a little bit later this morning. And even when he does return in chapter 9, he does come back to this area. It says that he does so in secret. He doesn't want anybody to know that he's there. He's not doing any big miracles. That part of his ministry is over. to this area because they have been so willfully stubborn in their reception of him. And on the other hand, what you have are Jesus' disciples. And like we could do a whole sermon series on Jesus' disciples and their funniness. That's all I can say there on that, is they're goofballs, guys. That's what they are. Just 12 goofballs walking around with Jesus. But these disciples, even though they just didn't get it. They were so just blinded by things. They really desired to embrace the truth. And again, although they sometimes struggled to comprehend exactly what Jesus was saying, their lack of sight is only temporary. Again, I want to say it, I want to be very clear about this as we go through everything this morning, like what in the world is Ryan talking about? Everything this morning has to do with spiritual sight. Either you have it or you don't. Either you are permanently spiritually blind or you are temporarily blind. And it's this contrast between temporary and tragic spiritual blindness that is at the heart of what Jesus does in this healing that he does right after he has his confrontation with the Pharisees. Skipping down to verse 22, it says this: When they arrived at Bethsaida, some people brought a blind man to Jesus, and they begged him to touch the man and to heal him. And Jesus took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village, and then spitting on the man's eyes. Now, I just want you to imagine that, by the way. Right on your eyes. That's offensive, by the way. But it doesn't give any indication here that this guy is offended. It probably was at that time a very common and a very natural way of healing people. Not that there was anything magical about spit, but on a very natural level, sometimes. Do you ever remember when you used to wake up as a kid and you had pink eye? And you're try to wake up in the morning, you're and you can't get your eyes open. What do you need to get your eyes open? You need wet. You need liquid. You need a warm shower. You need something. Very really and truly, that's probably what Jesus was doing here. This man was blind. His eyes were probably matted shut, and it probably just simply needed something like a spit. Now, if I'm thinking, I'm like, Jesus, why didn't you just go draw some water from a well, use that? But it would have made the story even close to how cool it is when Jesus spits in your eyes, all right? Spits in the man's eyes. He laid his hands on him and asked him, "Can you see anything now?" The man looked around. "Yes," he said, "I see people, but I can't see them very clearly. They look like trees walking around." And then Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes again, and his eyes were opened. His sight was completely restored, and he could see everything clearly. And then Jesus sent him away, saying, "Don't go back to the village on your way home." Now, some things about Bethsaida. Bethsaida was the hometown of Peter and Andrew and Philip and probably Nathanael. And much like Capernaum, we talked about Capernaum a couple weeks ago. Capernaum was a large fishing village and had a large fishing empire there. Bethsaida was the very same way, almost kind of a carbon copy of Capernaum. It was an important fishing town in its own right. And this healing that we see here, starting in verse 22, is very significant for a number of reasons. One of those being is that perhaps as important as anything else that Jesus says in this entire section, which runs from about 8:22 to about chapter 10, verse 52, is that the whole block of teaching starts with a man being healed from blindness, and it ends with a man being healed from blindness. Remember the story of blind Bartimaeus? Blind Bartimaeus is what ends this whole section in Mark chapter 10. Well, that's very fascinating on one level, and I think there's something to be said for that. I think that Mark is trying to communicate something in using those two stories to cap off this whole section. But secondly, something is happening in this miracle that is speaking a very loud message that we would initially just kind of look over, and we would not even think twice about. I want you to notice what it says he does with the man in a very interesting move that Jesus doesn't do very often. And this shows you how his ministry is switching at this point. We're told that Jesus escorts the man out of town. And after the healing, it says he wouldn't let the man go back into the town. And we would think to ourselves, some of us wouldn't, but we have to ask ourselves, why in the world, when Jesus has this entire time been very public about his healings, why would he take this man and pull him out of town, be very isolated, be very private about this miracle? And it's my hunch that in doing this, what Jesus is really doing is he is confirming the permanent spiritual blindness of the crowds and his judgment on them. It's like, you no longer deserve to have me show you who I am, because you have been so hard-hearted. And as Jesus is condemning them, you see what he's doing? He's condemning this area, but he is freeing this man from his physical blindness. What's really happening in this moment is that the crowds and this man are going in two opposite directions. And what's happening on a small scale here is taking place in a larger scale as the story moves along. And we'll see that as we talk about this idea of spiritual sight. And not only is here in Mark 8:22 the first specific instance of a blind person being brought to Jesus, there is a rhyme to the reason for why this story falls right here in the gospel. Again, don't be mistaken whether you're reading Mark or you're reading any other gospels. They write the stories for a specific purpose and in a very specific way, to tell a story about Jesus. This is the only time, not only in Mark, but in the whole New Testament, that Jesus performs a miracle. And did you notice what happened? He goes to heal the man and he says, "What do you see?" He says, "I see some things, but they're not really clear." "Well, let me lay my hands on you again, and now you're completely healed." Do you see? It was like a two-stage healing. That has never happened before in Mark. But what have we said over here in Mark? When Jesus heals somebody, it happens instantly. They are restored completely right there in that moment. But for some reason at this point, there's a two-stage process that happens. And again, I ask myself, why? Why is this? Why is this miracle so different from everything else that Jesus has done to this point? And this is just speculation, but I believe he's using this healing as an object lesson for his disciples. In fact, if you would look at verses 17 and 18, he has this confrontation with the Pharisees, and then they get in the boat. And again, this is just kind of the dullness of the disciples. Jesus starts talking about the leaven of the Pharisees, about the yeast of the Pharisees, that just a little bit of the Pharisees' bad teaching will infect. It will pull you off of where you need to be. And Jesus starts talking about bread, and the guys go, "Oh, geez, how stupid are we? We didn't bring any bread. We don't have enough bread for everybody on this boat." And Jesus goes, "Guys, I'm not talking about bread." It says in verses 17 and 18, "Why are you arguing about having no bread? Don't you know, or don't you understand even yet? Are your hearts too hard to take it in? You have eyes, but you can't see. You have ears, but you can't hear." You remember those words, don't you? We read almost those same words back in Mark chapter 4. It's the reason he told in parables. He said, "You disciples, you're not getting it. Don't you remember anything at all," is what he says. And here's a really interesting thing about Jesus' ministry. Here's where we are in Jesus' ministry, because sometimes we get lost in where are we at in Jesus' ministry? How close is he to the cross? We are less than a year away from the cross at this point in Mark's gospel. And Jesus' followers were still more concerned about low-level issues than spiritual truths that Jesus was trying to instill and teach them. And as a result, what happens, especially in this case right here, they completely miss the significance of most of Jesus' teaching. Jesus is teaching up here, and the disciples aren't even in the ballpark. They just don't get it. Their eyes had been open to the truth constantly, but they were still largely spiritually dull. They were temporarily blind. You can see and start to begin to understand why Jesus does this miracle of healing this man from his blindness. And even though the disciples are kind of blinded, they're kind of confused, and can we just admit sometimes when we read Scripture and we think about things, we're like, I don't get that. Jesus, I don't get that. Why would you do that? Why would you say that? Why would you act like that? All of this for the disciples was soon to change with two of the most stunning moments of Jesus' ministry. Guys, this right here, what we're getting ready to come to, is the pinnacle of Jesus' ministry in the book of Mark. This is where everything has pointed to this point. And what Jesus is trying to do is he's trying to clear up the disciples' blurry vision. He changes venue and he changes the narrative completely in everything. Mark chapter 8, starting at verse 27. Jesus and his disciples left Galilee and they went up to the villages near Caesarea Philippi. And as they were walking along, he asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" "Well," they replied, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're Elijah, some say you're just one of the other prophets. And then he asked them, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter replies, "You are the Messiah." Some translations say, "You are the Christ." Now I want to emphasize again, a lot of people will think this. The name Christ is not Jesus' last name. It is a title, all right? His mom's name was not Mary Christ, and his dad's name, his stepdad was not Joseph Christ. That was his title. It meant the anointed one. Messiah comes from the Hebrew word Mashiach, anointed one. That's what Peter says in this moment. But Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. I want to give you an idea of what's happening here in the geography of things. I think I have a map that's in there. You may not be able to see everything on this, but if you can see Galilee up there, that's where he does most of his ministry. Capernaum is right there on the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee, and then he moves all the way up. You can see at the top of the map there's a place there called Paneas. That was a region. Just under that is a little dot that says Caesarea Philippi. It's quite a trek from Bethsaida to Caesarea Philippi. Even on modern roads in a car today, you're still talking about an hour or two trip. And you think to yourself, Jesus has spent so long, he spent a majority of his ministry in that little area of Galilee. Why in the world now is he going way up north? Guys, this is the outer reaches of Israelite territory. It really seems to be the most unlikely place for Jesus to take his disciples and for Mark to kind of unfold this, "You are the Christ." We understand a few things about Caesarea Philippi. Some of you know about this area well, some of you do not. The area at that time was a massive, massive mecca for pagan worship. Guys, this isn't friendly territory at all. The town of Caesarea Philippi was actually a collection of villages, but the main attraction was a temple that had been built by Herod the Great to honor the Emperor Caesar Augustus. And Herod's son, when Herod the Great split his kingdom into 4 parts, his son Philip took that area and was responsible for that area, and he built the town up around this temple, and that's why we have Caesarea Philippi, a town that was given in honor of Caesar, and to separate it from another Caesarea that was over on the coast, Philip himself named it after himself, Philippi. And again, like I said, it was a place that was a very, very dark place. In fact, the reason it was called Paneas was one of their biggest gods that they worshiped there was the god Pan. Pan was like a half-human, half-goat guy that played the flute. Now, I don't know why in the world you'd be like, "I want to worship that," but they did. In fact, if you go there today, you can still see they would build these little kind of memorials to them in the caves in the area of Caesarea Philippi. You can still see those today. There's a lot of significant things about this area, though. We'll talk about one of them later, about the mountain that sits there at Caesarea Philippi. But this was the source of the Jordan River here in Caesarea Philippi. And so people saw this as a very holy site. There's all kinds of stuff going on. Emperor worship, Pan worship, any kind of worship that you could imagine. And Jesus decides to bring his disciples to this area to finally decide, who am I? Am I just one of these gods? Am I just one of these people that you're talking about? John the Baptist, Elijah? Or am I something more than that? At this point in Jesus' ministry, the 12 had been with him for nearly 2 years, following him in everything for 2 years. And as most people did who were good Jews, they had high hopes that Jesus was something special. That maybe, just maybe, Jesus was the Messiah that they had been looking for and longing for all of their life. And beyond that every Jewish person longed for thousands of years. And Jesus asked them this opening question that's a very interesting one. He says, "Hey, guys, just wanting to get a little bit of a feel here. This isn't like arrogant Jesus, like, tell me all the good stuff people are saying about me. Who do people say that I am?" I mean, Jesus wants the disciples to kind of assess the opinion of the masses. And by all accounts, he is faring really well in the public opinion polls. If you would have polled it then, people would have been like, Jesus, we're on the Jesus train. That's what we want. I mean, he's a great guy, healing people, great teaching, wonderful stuff going on with Jesus. These opinions all have an element of truth to them, but they don't tell the whole truth. He is sort of kind of like John the Baptist, sort of kind of like Elijah. But saying this, or I love the last part of it, he is just one of the other prophets. And saying and believing and living and acting like Jesus is just one of the best, or one of the greatest, or one of the noblest, or one of the most important figures in history is kind of like telling your wife that she is among the most beautiful women that you've ever met in your life. Guys, I would suggest you probably don't lead with that line. Oh, honey, you're among one of the more beautiful women that I've ever seen in my life. That ain't gonna get you anywhere. Anywhere. It's kind of like telling your husband that he is the last man that you have loved in a long line of men that you have loved. That's not a compliment, by the way. That wouldn't work, would it? It wouldn't fly in your marriage. It wouldn't fly in a relationship. You know, you're the best friend that I have right now at this very moment. Doesn't work. It's like you're telling your kid, like I would be like telling Brenda, you are my favorite oldest daughter. It's not a great compliment. Like, you are my only oldest daughter that I have. Jesus, guys, is not one of the best. He is not among the greatest. He is the one. That's it. Jesus is wholly unique. He's not like anything, or he's not like anyone. Completely unique in every way imaginable. If you look at Jesus and you think that he is only a precursor or a pointer and he is not the point, you have missed the point. To say that Jesus is only a pointer or a prophet or a pretty important person is like saying that Michael Jordan or LeBron James are just basketball players. Or that Jimi Hendrix is just some guitar player. Or that Taylor Swift is just some singer. Or that Einstein was just some scientist. Or that George W. Bush is from Texas. Those are all true things, aren't they? George W. Bush is from Texas. Jimi Hendrix did play guitar. Taylor Swift does have a voice, but you're missing the point. But Jesus is just getting warmed up with this opening question. Who do people say that I am? His next question really gets to the heart of the matter. And guys, I'm convinced of this. This is the question of life. And it's not just a question that you ask yourself, and then once you have accepted Jesus and you feel like you know who Jesus is, you go, I don't have to worry about that question anymore. I think you need to ask yourself this question constantly. Who do you? I'm not asking what your neighbor thinks. I'm not asking what your mom thinks. I'm not asking what your uncle thinks. I'm not asking who do you say that Jesus is? And we understand this, don't we, guys? Life is filled with a number of important questions. Which college are you going to? Will you marry me? Which job opportunity will I take? Which house will I choose? The ultimate questions, in fact, of our time, I'm convinced, are, am I happy? Am I being true to myself? Am I successful? Am I going to leave a legacy? But guys, no question in life is more important than who is Jesus Christ to you. The question is so foundational that if you get this question wrong, you won't be able to get much else right in life. Guys, you remember in school when you went and you had tests and you're like, man, I'd be really happy if I just got a C on this test today. And they're like, it ain't an A, B, C, D, F test. It's a pass-fail test. You're like, oh, geez, I hate the pass-fail test. That's so much more pressure. I just wanted to shoot middle of the road. That's all I was going for today. This is the ultimate pass-fail test. If you get it right, you are well on your way to getting most of the important things in life right. And Peter's confession here in Mark 8 is the turning point of the entire gospel. From it, all events move toward Jerusalem and the conclusion of Jesus' life and his ministry. It's only the second time that the word, when Peter says, "You are the Christ," "You are the Messiah," it is the second time that the word is used in Mark, and it's the first, since you remember the very opening verse of Mark, don't you? Go back there again and look at it. Mark says in 1:1, this is the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of God. Interestingly enough, it also takes place in the very center of the gospel, and it serves as the hinge on which the whole book turns. Between the first half of the book that focuses on Jesus' power and the second half of the book, and what we're going to talk about for the next few weeks, focuses and expresses his weakness so predominantly. Everything about Jesus from this point will be about him kind of winding things down, and he will look so weak and he will look so powerless in everything that he does. Guys, Jesus is the expected Messiah, no doubt, but he is the expected Messiah in the most unexpected manner. And that's coming up here in just a moment when he begins to talk about things. This moment marks the highest of highs and is followed closely by the lowest of lows. Peter's confession here at this point in Mark 8 shows that someone can be simultaneously so right and so wrong. Continuing on in verse 31, Jesus says this. I just want you to imagine this moment, guys. You're there with all the disciples, and Peter says, we have come to this conclusion. Jesus, we have been talking amongst ourselves. I don't believe this is just Peter's confession. It's just that Peter is the loudest mouth on the bunch. And so he speaks out. I believe all the disciples at this point have come to this conclusion. You are the Christ. And all the disciples go, yay! And they're celebrating. They're like, yeah, guys, finally, we get it. Our eyes have been opened. Verse 31. Jesus began to tell them that the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things. Like the balloon just got blown up and then pop. And he must be rejected by the elders and the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. He will be killed, but 3 days later he will rise from the dead. As he talked about this openly, now this is very interesting because what has Jesus done largely to this point of the gospel? Shh. Don't say anything. And he's done this. I'm going to teach you in parables so it'll just confuse you. He teaches them openly, clearly, plainly about his death and his suffering. Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. And Jesus turned around and he looked at all his disciples. Again, I believe this is just because Peter is the loudest mouth on the block. He expresses it, but all the disciples believe this. Oh, Jesus, surely not. Suffering? Get away from me, Satan. Now, can you remember like the worst day of your life? The absolute worst day, or you've had those days where it just doesn't seem like anything is going right, and you're like, man, this is a pit. God, I don't know about you, but I cannot imagine a lower day than Jesus looking you square in the eyes and saying, Satan, get away from me. That's not pretty. You are the Christ. You are the Messiah. Satan. You're like, Peter, you had it, and you lost it in a matter of how many verses? You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's. And then calling the crowd to join his disciples, he said, that's a very interesting to me, by the way. Up here in Caesarea Philippi, in probably the most pagan part of Israelite territory, not only is he talking to his disciples, he calls the entire crowd to come and listen to what he's about to say. If any of you wants to be my follower, you must turn from your selfish ways, take up your cross, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake and for the sake of the good news, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world, but you lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? Guys, the quest to uncover who Jesus is and his identity doesn't end with a confession. Life would be really great if all we had to do was show up and say, I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. I accept that. If that was the end of things, life would be pretty stinking easy, wouldn't it? That's not the problem that we have, that most people have, is to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Sure, some people struggle with that. That's not the struggle most of the time. The disciples, guys, and we cannot know who Jesus really is without accepting the necessity of suffering and death. And they cannot be disciples, and we cannot be disciples of Jesus unless we accept that fate for ourselves. You see where I'm going, right? Like everybody's on board, like Jesus, Messiah, good things, wonderful stuff. Suffering and death. What? Wait a minute, stop. Did I mishear that? Suffering and death? What? I'm out. In fact, this is very close to, if you would put all the Gospels together, John chapter 6. We're at that point right now. John chapter 6, Jesus starts to say some weird things about, if you're going to follow after me, here's what's going to happen. You'll eat my flesh, you'll drink my blood, and the disciples start going, what? Like, he really has lost it now. And what does it say in John chapter 6 towards the end? All the disciples desert him. Gone. Guys, a disciple must do more than just get Jesus' title right. That is only the first step in following Jesus on the way. The next sayings lay out plainly what Jesus and following Jesus requires. And I want you to tune in because I think this is where we so often lose the heart of the gospel. This is so often where we lose the heart of Christianity. This is so often where the church goes off the rails. Well, all the good stuff, but we don't want to hear this stuff that I'm about to say. Jesus says 3 things here. Number 1, deny the self. And that doesn't mean that you need to withhold things from yourself to be some sort of pious and holy person. No. Deny yourself and all of your self-promoting ambitions. What Jesus is saying here really and largely, guys, in these very powerful words, is that discipleship and following after Jesus is not part-time volunteer work. It's not an extracurricular activity that you just tag on to everything in your life. And if something else becomes more important in your life, then you just choose to let that go. You just choose to let Jesus go. You choose to let following Jesus go. Jesus is saying, give up your right to self-determination. Live as I tell you to live. Treasure and value Jesus more than you do yourself or your comforts or your aspirations. Put to death the idol of I, me. I think it would be a fun practice if just one day in our lives we were very in tune and listened to ourselves and we marked down all the times that we said, I, me. Now, not all of them would be arrogant and self-centered, but a lot of them would be. Guys, say no to you and say yes to Jesus. That's what he's talking about when he's talking about deny self. What's the next thing he talks about? Like, whoa, Ryan, that was enough. Let's just stop there. No, Jesus doesn't stop there. Take up a cross. What's Jesus saying? It's what he would say in the other Gospels. You need to count the cost of what this is going to mean to follow after me. And we know this very well, don't we? The Romans made the condemned of that day carry the crossbeam to the place of execution. Jesus himself would do that in less than a year in Jerusalem. Jesus' use of this image means Jesus expects his followers to be willing to join the ranks of the lowly and the despised. You must lower yourself even to the point of death if necessary. He is saying die, and he adds to this constantly, die daily. Over and over again. This is not normal. This is not natural, but it is necessary to be Christ's disciple. And it is a slow and painful death. It's the last thing he says. Deny yourself, take up your cross, follow me. Follow the way that he has chosen. Not the way that you would choose for yourself. See, often left to our own devices, we choose a very different path than the way that God, the way that Jesus, the way the Spirit leads us. Follow me? Are we willing to believe and obey Jesus? See, this is often where things break down. It will be radical. It will not be comfortable because it involves a death to a self-centered life. And here's the thing. We look at this most of the time and we're like, geez, this is out there. We use words like, this is really radical, what you're saying right now. And you guys are looking at me right now and you're like, yeah, Ryan, we know all this stuff. But do we really know this? And even more sad than that, there are so many people who sit in churches Sunday after Sunday and they never hear this part. It's not radical. It is what Jesus is saying is this is a normal part of an expectation of a Christian life, of following Jesus. And so we wonder why in the world, not to say that every little irritation and thing that we get upset about is some sort of cross for us. Please don't do that. That's my cross. It's my cross to bear. I don't think the fact that you woke up this morning and didn't have milk for your Lucky Charms is a cross to bear. This is the expectation of a normal Christian life. Peter, you are the Christ. Peter, a few verses later, Jesus, you know what Peter's doing there? It says he rebukes Jesus. He reprimands Jesus. It's the very same word that Jesus has been using all this time when the demons, and he's trying to pull the demons out of people. He says, hush, silence, out of them. Peter comes to Jesus and says the very same thing to Jesus, and Jesus turns right back around and says, you hush. Get behind me, Satan. Peter plummets from the brightest A+ student in the class to the dunce, and that quick. So guys, if Peter, who has spent 2 years constantly with Jesus, is still not getting it, do you think that we today might still need a little bit of tweaking on our hearts and our minds? Peter was on board with Jesus as Messiah. Peter was not on board with Jesus going to the cross. And I think that's the problem, guys. I think that is the big, big thing, not only in this part of Mark, but is the big, big thing in the church today. Getting on board with Jesus as Messiah is much easier and acceptable than a suffering Messiah who also calls us to come and die. Guys, we like the glory, don't we? We like the good stuff. We hate the guts. We want the accolades, but we can't get our minds around the agony. You know what I thought this week when I was thinking about this idea of deny self, take up a cross, follow me. You remember Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, don't you? You remember the character Veruca Salt? She goes and she's in Willy Wonka's factory and she goes and she wants the goose that lays the golden egg and she sings this song, doesn't she? I don't have the video because it'd take too long, but she sings this song, I want it now. And she snobbily and brattily prances around that and sings this song. And then we all cheer when she falls down the chute and we're like, yeah, serves you right. Guys, that's our life, isn't it? We're Veruca Salt. We're Peter in Caesarea Philippi. Yes, Jesus, you are the Messiah. No. I'm not deny myself, take up a cross, die, follow you. Jesus, I want it now. I want the good stuff now. I don't have to wait. See, that's a really tough thing about Jesus. Jesus and following Jesus is a life that is built around not yet. Yes, we get to experience some things in this life, but we don't get to experience the fullness of it. Not yet. Not yet. No, I want it now, Jesus. I believe that what really caused the disciples to stumble at this point was that they understood that if Jesus had to suffer and he had to be rejected and he had to die, that probably meant the same for them. They received these words not only as a death sentence for Jesus, but also for themselves. And that is the last thing that they wanted to hear at this point. And so, because Peter can't get it and the disciples can't get it, he rakes them over the coals, rebukes Jesus. You understand this, right? Like, understand what's going on here. You're like, why in the world was Jesus getting so mad at Peter? mean, I understand Peter's a goofball, but come on. Give the guy a little slack. The heart of Jesus' greatest temptation was getting a throne and getting glory without the pain and suffering. You remember in Matthew chapter 4, don't you, the story? Jesus experiences baptism and the Father telling him, "You are my beloved Son." And then it says immediately and directly after that, he's put out into the wilderness for 40 days where he is tested and he is tempted by Satan. And you understand what Satan is doing at every point there is, don't you? Oh, Jesus. I mean, I know that you think that you need to go through all of this suffering and agony and that there's a cross at the end of this, but if you would just do this, we can bypass all of that. Luke tells us about that account that Satan departed from Jesus until an opportune time. Who could have foreseen that the opportune time would follow right on the heels of the highest confession of faith? Someone has said it this way: the arch enemy has resurfaced in Jesus' most prominent disciple, Peter. Satan slyly uses one disciple, Peter, to try and steer Jesus away from his death and his suffering and God's will, and he uses another disciple, Judas, to lead Jesus to his death. But isn't this how life is, guys? And this is why I love Scripture, because we say, that's cool, that's great, Ryan. I mean, we understand, we've read this story 1,000 times, but we understand what's going on at the heart of this story. This is how life works. The highest peaks of life for us are often and very quickly followed by the lowest valleys, aren't they? Guys, if we are to be followers of Jesus, we must embrace his suffering. It must be our suffering, his rejection. We must be willing to be rejected. His death. We die daily. We don't have to worry about it much in this country, but who knows, someday we will. That physical death will face us if we claim Christ. Because that's what it costs to stand with Jesus. And in contrast to much of what passes for Christianity today, the gospel that was preached by Jesus was a sobering call to self-denial and to suffering and to absolute surrender. I have a quote I'm going to put up here, I'm going to read through. It's a longer one, but it is so good and it's so penetrating and it's so hard to hear, but we need to hear it. We American Christians, this is David Platt speaking, we American Christians have a way of taking the Jesus of the Bible and twisting him into a version of Jesus that we are more comfortable with. A nice, middle-class American Jesus. A Jesus who doesn't mind materialism and would never call us to give away everything that we have. A Jesus who is fine with nominal devotion that doesn't infringe on our comforts. A Jesus who wants us to be balanced, who wants us to avoid dangerous extremes, and who, for that matter, wants us to avoid danger altogether. A Jesus who brings comfort and prosperity to us as we live out our Christian spin on the American dream. And that's a sad thing, guys, that many of us and most of us are just living our spin of Christianity. It's a distortion of the gospel, and it's meant to support our lust for and our pursuit of the American dream. That's not what Jesus calls his disciples to. Guys, there is no crown without the cross. True disciples of Jesus understand that suffering and self-denial and servanthood are equal parts of the gospel. See, all we want to talk about is grace and mercy and love, and those are true. Those are parts of the gospel. But it's part of the gospel. The whole gospel also involves suffering and death and servanthood and denying ourselves. There's a man by the name of Neil Postman that says this: I believe I am not mistaken in saying that Christianity is a demanding and serious religion. When it is delivered as easy and amusing, it is another kind of religion altogether. And I guess maybe we should be asking ourselves, is that the way that we would describe our lives in following Jesus. It's not that bad. It's pretty easy. It might be because we're not following an actual Jesus. The actual Jesus. And so because the disciples can't get it and they're struggling with this idea of denying self and taking up a cross, Jesus, in a moment of grace, gives them something that they need to see. This is the most fascinating part of Mark's Gospel, chapter 9, verses 2 through 10. 6 days later, after this whole thing of Jesus, you are the Christ. Jesus, no, there can't be suffering. He takes Peter and James and John. He led them up a high mountain to be alone. I was just doing some looking this week, and I was like, what is this mountain? I think I have a picture. It's probably towards the end there, Trixie, of Mount Hermon is where they believe the Transfiguration took place. It is the highest place in all of Israel. It's not that land, but you can get a good idea of what Caesarea Philippi looked like. But it's that snow-capped mountain that's up above there, over 9,000 feet tall. If you are standing on Mount Hermon on a clear day and you are looking back down towards Jerusalem, you can see all the way down the Jordan River Valley and down to Jerusalem, which is miles and miles away. This is an impressive, impressive mountain. And he takes them up there to be alone. And as the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed, and his clothes became dazzling white, far whiter than any earthly bleach could ever make them. Then Elijah and Moses appeared and began talking with Jesus. And Peter exclaimed, "Rabbi, it's wonderful for us to be here. Let's make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." And he said this because he didn't really know what to say. They were all terrified. And then a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my dearly loved Son." Sound familiar? Mark chapter 1, Jesus' baptism. "This is my dearly loved Son. I am pleased with him," but he says something different here. This is my dearly loved Son. Listen to him. Suddenly, when they looked around, Moses and Elijah were gone, and they saw only Jesus with them. And as they went back down the mountain, he told them not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. And so they kept it to themselves, but they often asked each other what he meant by rising from the dead. In the Old Testament, when God appeared visibly to people in the Old Testament, he always did so in some form of light. And the purpose was always to strengthen people's faith, not to freak them out or not to scare them. Jesus takes his disciples, these 3 disciples, up on this mountain to increase their faith, to strengthen their faith. And with the exception of the Transfiguration that we just read, Jesus' glory was always veiled during his life and ministry. But in this moment, as one person has said, his glory was bursting out. And if we're not careful, we look at this and we read the Transfiguration, we think of it as just a bright light that shone on Jesus, almost like he is in the high school musical or the high school play and the person has a spotlight and they're like, "That's it, guys, right there." The light wasn't shining on Jesus. It wasn't coming from the outside. The light was Jesus. It was coming from inside of him. The word transfigured actually means a change that's on the outside that comes from the inside. It's the opposite of the word masquerade, which is an outward change that doesn't come from an inward shift or change. The transfiguration of Jesus confirms that despite having the outward appearance of a mere mortal man, he is in his nature and in his essence God, deity dressed in a body. Guys, this wasn't a new miracle, but it was a temporary pause on an ongoing miracle. Guys, do you know what the real miracle of Jesus was? Not healing deaf people, not giving people sight, not casting out demons, not calming storms. You know what the real miracle of Jesus was? That most of the time he could keep from displaying the glory that was him, that defined him. Charles Spurgeon has said it this way: "For Christ to be glorious was almost a less matter than for him to restrain or hide his glory. And it is forever his glory that he concealed his glory, and that though he was rich, for our sakes he became poor." That he came down to this earth and he put skin on so that he could be like us and he could know us. That is the real miracle of everything. That everywhere he walked, that glory didn't just burst out from him, that it didn't just show, because that is what is contained in Jesus Christ of Nazareth, the Messiah, the Son of God. And then there's Peter again. Like, do you ever have that moment where you just speak because you don't have anything to say? Like, there's something that needs to be said here, so I just need to say it. That's this moment for Peter. He is babbling and he is speaking without any sort of thought. You guys ever have that uncle, that family member that is just constantly running their mouth? You're just embarrassed of them. You're like, oh, just shut up, seriously already. That's Peter. Peter, you're embarrassing us. And in Peter's request, there's still the hint. He says, Lord, let us set up 3 shelters, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. He's still wanting to live in this moment rather than the reality of life. The cross and the suffering that Jesus has said is necessary. Guys, wouldn't it be awesome if all of our life we could just stay on the mountaintop? Like the moment that you have ever felt closest to Jesus, you're like, that's it right there. I just want to stay right there in that moment forever. It'd be wonderful to stay on the mountaintop and bask in the glory, but the normal Christian life often takes place in the valleys, in the moments of self-denial and cross-bearing and following obediently after Jesus, just the churning. I always go back to this book and I think of it. Eugene Peterson wrote a book years ago called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. That's the Christian life. Just some days we just got to trudge. We've got to keep going. We've got to keep being faithful. Case in point, what's very interesting, if you would read on this story, we don't have time to read on this story, but Jesus comes down from this mountain. Do you know what he's immediately met with? A demon-possessed boy. That he graciously and he mercifully casts out this demon. I mean, it would have been great, right? Jesus stays up on this mountain. He's like, nobody will bother me up here. But he recognizes, we need to realize as well, life doesn't take place on the mountaintops. It takes place down in the valleys. I'm going to close this morning with a Puritan prayer. It was written many years ago. It's called the Valley of Vision. And I just want this to kind of be the way that we end. And it'll be our prayer to end for this morning. So if the worship team wants to come back up, this will be our prayer. Lord, high and holy, meek and lowly, you have brought us to the valley of vision, where we live in the depths, but we see you in the heights. Hemmed in by the mountains of sin, I behold your glory. Let me learn the paradox, that the way down is the way up. That to be low is to be high. That the broken heart is the healed heart. That the contrite spirit is the rejoicing spirit. That the repenting soul is the victorious soul. That to have nothing is to possess everything. That to bear the cross is to wear the crown. That to give is to receive. That the valley is the place of vision. Guys, the valley is where we truly see Jesus. Lord, and the daytime stars can be seen from the deepest wells, and the deeper the wells, the brighter your star shines. Let me find your light in the darkness, your life in my death, your joy in my sorrow, your grace in my sin, your riches in my poverty, your glory in my valley. Amen.
fall.